Hi, everyone. This is Zach Rubin. I'm the Executive Director of the Alumni Learning Consortium, and I'm here today with Helen Kim and Cassie Petoskey from Northwestern University, who will be presenting today on their experience developing an alumni podcast. And their podcast, it's one of the most successful that we've seen just in the space, so we're really excited to have them share today. There definitely will be time for questions, so please click the Ask a Question button below the video to enter your questions, and we'll have time for those at the end of the presentation. And I'll hand it over to Helen and Cassie to get us started here.
Thanks, Zach. Hi, everyone. I just want to thank you all for joining us today. Cassie and I are super excited to be here. And I'm sure you're here because you either want to start a podcast or you're going through a transition or you want to maintain a successful alumni podcast. So Cassie and I are here to talk all about that. So you're in the right place. But, before we start, I do want to give you all a little bit of the context of me and Cassie's relationship so that you understand where this is coming from. So like Zach said, my name is Helen. I'm currently the Assistant Director of Alumni Engagement at the Northwestern Alumni Association. So I actually graduated from Northwestern. Class of 2016, and I joined the Alumni Association as a program assistant around end of 2017, seems like ages ago. But I joined as their program assistant, and when I joined, Cassie, who was in my team, she was already in the preparation phase of starting a podcast. And to be transparent with you all, and Cassie knows this too, I didn't have any experience in audio editing. And to be frankly honest, a podcast was not the number one thing that I would listen from my iTunes or Apple Podcasts. So it was something of an interest, but it's just something I never either majored in or had complete expertise in, but I was very interested in. So I joined her podcast team to see where it went off. And so I was part of the founding team with Cassie, another program assistant, and I, and that's how Northwestern Intersections came to be. And around middle of 2019, Cassie joined another team, same department but another team. And she'll talk about that later about her new role. But when she left, I actually got promoted into her role, which is the current role that I'm in. So I am now the host and the executive producer of Northwestern Intersections, but I also manage our career webinar series that goes on weekly. So that is just a little bit of a context between Cassie and I, but I'm going to hand it off to Cassie so she can talk about her previous role and her current role.
Great. Thanks, Helen. As Helen mentioned, I kind of grew the podcast idea out of the webinar series that she mentioned, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we get into the presentation. But I started with the Northwestern Alumni Association, I think in 2016, and was there for a year before really coming up with this idea. And then it was another year before we launched it. And then last summer, I transitioned to the Weinberg College team within Alumni Relations. So I just moved upstairs, still in the same department and building, but I'm on a different team working more closely with students and alumni. And so that's when the podcast really transitioned. So we'll get into the agenda and we'll talk through a little bit more about the details here. As we went through introductions, we'll go through a program overview, the why we started the podcast, the how, the transition. Helen will take over with the maintaining and sustaining because she's been doing a great job with that. And then I'll talk a little bit about a new podcast that we just launched with my new role through the Weinberg College and the brand strategy there. And then we'll close out with lessons learned and some recommendations and things to consider for you all before getting to Q&A. So this is kind of our brand for the Northwestern Intersections podcast. As Helen was mentioning, she's in charge of the webinars and the podcasts. When I started at Northwestern, the career webinar series was under my purview. And as I was hosting these webinars, I was realizing that alumni were really interested in the host's career story. they would ask personal questions in the chat during webinars about like how this person got to where they are. And so it kind of started the idea in my head of, our alumni might be interested in hearing these career stories rather than just the professional development content that we have through the webinars. And so we really kind of dove into that and explored that a little further. And that's where the idea for the podcast began, is that we had this successful webinar series that our alumni really enjoyed. Helen has like hundreds of alumni on these webinars right now, which is awesome. So this was established already. And so bringing in an audio format seemed like a natural transition. And I will say too, like through the NAA, our leadership is really interested in being innovative. They're excited about new ideas. And so when the podcast came about, they're like, wow, this is, there's not a lot out there right now. This could be a really cool place where Northwestern could kind of lead in this area. So that goes into a little bit about the why, that was the original idea. And then when we got down to it to really put together a proposal, some of our original goals were that this was going to be approachable content for recent alumni, where it was easy to listen to, conversational, not necessarily professional development in your face, but career resources that were easy to digest. And it was another digital program for global alumni. We have alumni across the world tuning in from various time zones, and a podcast is really perfect for people who can't show up at a certain time. And it's just an easy resource to access for those folks around the world. And then another thing that we considered when we were starting this was that it was another great way to build the NAA brand in another platform where, maybe more recent alumni are listening to podcasts. We knew that we had a more mid-level career professional was watching the webinars. We were hoping that the podcast could reach this more recent alumni population and build the NAA brand with those folks. And then, of course, actually putting it together, that took the longest amount of time. The research, preparation, launch, and of course, getting into the sustaining and improving constantly. The research, we actually brought in an intern over the summer to do a lot of benchmarking with our peer institutions who had podcasts. And there were a lot of really great lessons learned across the industry with, starting with multiple episodes and getting content that our alumni base is really interested in learning about, having an idea of what, your schedule will be if you're going to do it consistently week by week. And so our student intern did a great job benchmarking, reaching out to those institutions. We learned a lot about the industry best practices. We also listened to similar podcasts, how we built this and other things, kind of gave us ideas for how we wanted to get the format for our podcast. And then we did attend some podcast events in Chicago. We're lucky that there are some pretty cool resources in the city for people who are interested in starting podcasts, whether that be in higher education or just, an individual who wants to get something up and running as a side gig. So those were also really helpful in figuring out how we were going to go about doing this. And then I think, Helen.
I'm going to take over the preparation side of how to start a podcast. So I think this is a really important slide because I know that a lot of universities have called us too on how to start one. And I think the technical side of it is one of the most asked questions that I get about what equipment do I buy? What software do I use? How do I learn how to use the software? So talking about the equipment first, honestly, you can start a podcast for very cheap. So what we bought was just 2 sets of microphones, which is the one I'm using right now. It's a Samson Q2U microphone. It's not as pricey as you would think. It's excellent quality. And so we have 2 of those, one for the host, one for the guests for in-person interviews. And we also purchased a new MacBook for recording. It's just one of the best laptops to just have recording purposes and audio editing purposes too. And for audio editing, we use Adobe Audition, and we were fortunate enough for just to have that downloaded into our laptops because our department provides that opportunity. So we had that set up in our laptops already. And then we had purchased a nice set of headphones. The one that I'm using right now, it's a Sony headphone. Just purchased it off online. And then for in-person interviews, when we invite alumni volunteers to come into our office, we usually have these microphones attached to a mic arm. So having two sets of those or a set of those would be really helpful and beneficial, just so that the alumni feel that they are somewhat in a recording studio space. We usually do it in our conference room, which has pretty good acoustics, but we want the guests to feel pretty legitimate about being a podcast guest. But the mic arms are really beneficial for those. And then developing an ideal program format. So our podcast, if you haven't heard yet, it's a one-on-one interview usually, and it's very conversational. We just want to know the story behind our alumni's career story and how they got to where they are, any mistakes that they made, because people love hearing that, because not everyone's perfect, and just their Northwestern experience and who has helped them get to where they are. So it's very conversational. It's just usually the host asking a lot of questions about their personal lives and just their career path. And then recording platforms, for in-person interviews, we use Zoom actually. For in-person interviews, we invite them to our office. We also have a handy recorder to attach to our microphones and record the interview entirely. And then we export that into Adobe Audition and start editing. For virtual interviews is what we use Zoom for, but nowadays we use Zoom for everything, since we're all working from home. So once you record on Zoom, you can download the recording of it and then convert it to an MP3 and easily edit it on Adobe Audition. And I mentioned Adobe Audition many times already, but that is the audio editing software that we use. And like I said, I did not have any experience in Adobe Audition. However, I used LinkedIn Learning, used to be called Lynda, but now LinkedIn Learning, to just go over the basic overviews of how to use it. And after practicing with a lot of audio files, it's something that's very easy to use, very intuitive. So it just takes time and practice to get used to editing, and you will become an expert in no time. And then, we've only interviewed with alumni volunteers so far. We just reach out to them or have colleagues recommend whoever they worked with before if they're great speakers. So that is the preparation part.
And I will also reiterate what Helen was saying, that I also didn't have any experience in this. This was brand new. Before I started at Northwestern, I would get confused between the rotor and the modem. Like, I'm not techie. I don't understand that side of things. So this was all new to me. Webinars was new with the tech glitches and figuring all that out. And then all this podcast stuff, that was just basically based on research. And then we had a colleague in our marketing department who's very familiar with podcasting. And so we were able to use him as a resource for figuring out what hosting software to use, like what is recommended in the industry. So this is definitely things that you can kind of learn if you're really interested in it, because it does take time, like Helen was saying. So going into the launch, we purchased a hosting software. We hosted and still host the program on Libsyn, and that spits it out to basically all of your favorite podcasting apps: iTunes, Spotify, Spreaker, whatever you call it, things like that. So that was nice that we had Libsyn to shoot it out to everything. You upload it there, and then it's on all podcast apps. And that's like as cheap as $5 a month. I think we have a $20 a month plan on that. And then for the launch, we of course developed a marketing plan. Our marketing plan early was getting people interested, listening, subscribing, so that, we didn't necessarily have to spit out emails every time we posted an episode. They would get that in their feed if they subscribed. And then, as we were launching, we worked with our marketing team to come up with, some exciting emails to share out that information with our alumni base. And of course, posting it to social media, LinkedIn and Twitter was mainly where we focused our energy. And then, as we mentioned, that we had this successful webinar series, we were able to promote episodes on our weekly webinars and also in our email communications about those webinars. We had already had those monthly emails going out, so we were able to plug in another great digital resource into those. So it wasn't necessarily creating like a whole new system for communications with the podcast, which was really nice, because that's half the energy of starting something like this, is developing the process for how you make things function consistently, right? And staying organized in that respect. So it was nice that we didn't necessarily have to think through like, how are we going to market these? We already have a monthly email that's going out that we can plug them into, which was great. And then of course, as soon as you launch, you're going to get we got a ton of feedback. We were constantly adapting the program, how we were doing the interviews, how we were doing the recordings, to make it easier to edit. I mean, each episode we were learning something new about how to make the process easier. Like starting, I used to start the recording as I was chit-chatting with alumni. And then we found it was easier for Helen to edit if we started the recording right when we were about to start the interview, rather than all that chit chat. Because it is nice to build the rapport, with the alumnus before you get into a recording, because, you're nervous because you want it to go well, but they're nervous because they want to share the right stuff. So, I was interviewing some really high level alumni and they were nervous. And I was like, oh, I need to help them be not nervous and kind of just chit chat before getting into it. So that was one example of how we updated the interview process. Same thing with editing. I am not the pro on this, Helen was, but there's constantly, as you learn the software, Adobe Audition, you're figuring out new ways to update that process. She would add tags in there with like, oh, here was a really cool quote from this alumnus, so that when we go down the line to do like a best of the first 10 episodes or something, she could just quickly go in and find those quotes, which was great down the line. And then we added transcriptions, because that's another industry best practice. If you have audio, you want to make sure that everyone's able to take advantage of that. And so we added transcriptions to the website, quickly after we started. And we had to develop a whole new process and system for how we uploaded transcriptions to the website, because you'd launch the episode, give it to the system to get transcriptions, add that in later. So that was something we had to get organized with. And then evaluating alumni feedback, which, when we launched, we had planned out, who were going to be our next few guests. And then as soon as we launched, everybody and their mom was reaching out saying, I have an alumnus. I want to be on the podcast. You should use my, donor. They're great. So we had like recommendations coming in from all angles. And so we created like an application form to be on the podcast, or like a recommendation form to organize all of those people, because we were getting them emailed to Helen, emailed to me, emailed to our other program assistant, chatted to us, mentioned in the hallway. And so you kind of have to think through how to organize that. And that was a question early on that I got when I started the podcast, was like, how do you pick your guests? And it's like, as soon as you spit this out, you're going to have really interesting people coming forward. As soon as I think I've had one person say no to being interviewed for a podcast, like they're excited to do it. So that is not necessarily a tough part. And then I just wanted to show this. This was some results that we had early on with the podcast, that we found that we were being listened to across the world. That was one of our goals early on, is like building the global brand. And we were listening, alumni from 57 countries were listening to our podcast within the first 6 months of being launched, which was awesome. So that was an exciting result. And then hopping into the transition.
Awesome. So the transition. So we all know that not everyone's going to be in the same role for many, many years. So like I said before, around summer of 2019, I believe, is when we had the transition of Cassie moving to another team and me moving into her new role. So basically what that meant for me was also to become the producer and editor to becoming the host. And, there is always a learning curve with new positions, new tasks. And I'm sure Cassie could attest to this too. We weren't born to be, podcasters, and that's not our major or what we studied, but it really does come from practicing. And I'm sure your first interview, you will feel very nervous about it, but I think the more you do it, it takes time and you have to constantly practice. I think one of the hardest things for myself and anyone, honestly, is to record yourself and listen to that interview and listen to your voice, because it sounds so different than what you think you sound or how you think you sound. And I know that is really difficult for a lot of people because we don't want to listen to ourselves a lot of the time. But you have to, for the sake of really improving how you talk to people, how you pronounce certain words, or how many filler words you have. It's incredible once, maybe on your first interview, it's incredible how many filler words you actually say, or maybe you don't say it. But these things are something that you learn by listening to yourself. So you have to do that. And that was a big learning curve. And I got to tell you, I edit some of our episodes too, still, from the interviews that I interview as the host. And it's still hard to listen to myself, but you got to get past that, really accept it and just get past it, and know that that's really helpful and beneficial for you in the long run. And then we actually, when we were hiring a new program assistant, it took about a couple of months. We actually added in the job description that we would prefer them to have an audio editing experience. It wasn't required. It was just preferred, just so that from Cassie and me and Cassie's experience, we learned that it's really helpful to have one other person on the team when you're starting a podcast, because it does take a lot of time to edit. So we wanted the new program assistant, hopefully, to be interested in audio editing like I was. And we were so lucky to have found another Northwestern alumna who, has experience in that. And she's now currently the producer and editor for our podcast, and she's doing an excellent job. So we really got lucky in that, but that's super helpful if you're trying to hire somebody in the future for your team to join your podcast team. And Cassie and I actually hosted a host transition episode where she was interviewing me and interviewing me for my Northwestern experience, my story, and how I'm feeling about moving into the host position. So that was a really popular one. And also it was important that our listeners, our loyal listeners, knew that this was happening, so we're not catching them off guard. So that was really important. And then next slide, please. Maintaining and sustaining. So these are not all the ways to maintain and sustain your podcast, but these are some of the things that I've noticed and seen are some of the best ways to maintain and sustain your podcast. So number one is to get creative. To be honest, we are trying to fight or compete against big podcast companies or companies like organizations like NPR, The Guardian, and a lot of other popular podcasts. But in order to gain your loyal listening and loyal followers, you want to get creative with your podcast episodes. So some of the things that we tried are, number one, we had an in-person live podcast event around our big tier cities. We'd have one in Chicago, where this was when Cassie was still in her previous role. She interviewed 4 recent alumni, like in a panel, to talk about their transitions into the real world after graduation. And we had a lovely event with networking event in the beginning and at the end. And we've had some audience members, and we recorded all of that and made it into a live event. And it was highly successful. A lot of people enjoyed it. I know that it was a recent alumni panel, but we had audience members from all different ages, different industries. So it was extremely fun for the hosts, guests, and the panelists. So that is an excellent way to try that out. We also went to New York. So this was when I was in the role. I flew out to New York for our recent alumni population there to host a panel. And we recorded that too. And it was another success. So highly recommend this event. If you can't fly out to anywhere, just do it in your hometown and see, if it's going to go well. I hope it will, because it did really well for us. The second one is we compiled a list of our most listened to episodes throughout the entire year of 2019. And then just picked out some of the quotes that we really enjoyed from each episode. And we compiled that into one short episode. And that was one of the highest and most popular episode that we've had so far and we produced. And then another one is like a mini series. So we've had 3 career coaches talking about professional development in their industries specifically. And that was also some of our most popular and most listened to episodes so far. So those are some ideas to get you kind of started on thinking about what can I do with our podcast program, because I think it's important to have a flow and a consistent schedule for your podcast, but including these creative ideas will help your listeners to be engaged more through the audio medium. And then the next thing is collaborating with your internal and external departments at your university. So this is really important for marketing purposes and for your brand purposes too. Internally, we need to create that relationship so that we can get amazing guests from our donor relations colleagues or major gifts officers, or even within our team, if they've worked with other volunteers that were great and that have amazing career stories, we want them to be on our podcast. And since they worked with them before, how they sound, the story that they're going to bring to your podcast. So it is really important to collaborate and build that relationship with your internal partners. With external departments, we've worked a lot with our campus partners, one of them being the Family Institute at Northwestern University. They are a nonprofit organization that is it's a counseling office. So we have a lot of wonderful family therapists who were willing to be on the podcast and who are also alumni to talk about marriage issues, talk about any relationships and etc. So that is an excellent way to really promote your podcast idea out throughout your campus too. So, and then the next one is keep promoting. Wherever you are, whichever meeting you are in, constantly mention the name of your podcast. So even in my emails, I wouldn't say podcast program. I would constantly say Northwestern Intersections. So people are used to hearing that, and that name will come off at the tip of their tongue easily, just so that they know and our branding is going out there so that we're doing a great job and people can listen to it and get more subscribers. And then last, but definitely not the least, take a break. This podcast program, this is not, Cassie and I are both in this role, this is not the only program that we were managing. We had multiple other programs too. So we can't give all our energy to this podcast program, no matter how much we wanted to. And you need to take a break so that you can have some time to brainstorm, have some time to get away from listening to yourself from editing. So I highly recommend, a month-long hiatus, which I'm taking right now before we kick off in June. So that is some of the tips that we have for that. So we just wanted to share some listenership statistics with you. So as of May 2020, we released 81 episodes, and we have about 50,868 listens and downloads. So we have, over time, we would get 500 to 600 listens per episodes. And then, like I said before, some of our most popular episodes would include those ones with high-level guests, and the compilation episodes, the one that I mentioned where we compile the best quotes from all of our most listened to episodes throughout the entire year of 2019. So those were some of the most popular ones. So I'm sure this slide, we had to add this since I'm sure it's something that a lot of people are very curious about. So you might be asking, well, since the pandemic started in United States around March and we were all starting to work from home during that time, how has the listenership been impacted by this? So you would think that it would decrease because a lot of people are now, attending to virtual events, literally everything, and trying to listen through all your, technical devices. So you would think that people would be jaded in listening to podcasts, but surprisingly, we've had an increase in the number of listenership. So in month of March 2020, we had about 1,800 listens and downloads, where we launched 4 episodes. However, in the month of April 2020, we had about 2,000 listens and downloads when we launched only 2 episodes. And we only launched 2 because I was starting to go on a hiatus in the middle of April. So this was an interesting fact to me, because when I saw the graphs too of how many people listen for March, it had a lot of peaks whenever we sent out a newsletter or had a huge promotional marketing day through LinkedIn. That's when our peaks were at, and that's when most people would listen to. But throughout the month of April, we saw that there was a consistent number of people listening. There weren't a lot of peaks, but there were a consistent number of people listening to the podcast throughout the month of April. So I'm really looking forward to how the listenership is going to go in June. Maybe we'll follow up with you all maybe later, but you just never know. And it's all about trial and error, and you got to be okay with that. And then for us, like I mentioned, that we are taking a hiatus so we can brainstorm well. There's a new season coming up in June, and, I don't want to spill the beans yet because we're still in the brainstorming phase, but we're hoping to interview alumni about how they're helping out in their community during this time. We also hope to interview students. So that's going to be brand new. We've never had students on there before, but I'm sure a lot of people are wondering how the students are doing during this time and how they're feeling about going back maybe online to, start their fall quarter. So that's all coming up. We're still in the brainstorming phase, but those are some of the things that we've had to make changes for during this time.
Yeah, absolutely. And as Helen was mentioning about the new season coming up, that was another thing that we kind of evolved once we started, because we just wanted to release weekly episodes when we launched. And then after about 9 months, we decided we needed to do like 12 episode seasons or so that we could have a little bit of a break to brainstorm and plan for the next one. So that was another evolution, which I think is really helpful because it sounds like some interesting stuff is coming up. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about the new podcast that we launched through the Weinberg College in my new role. As Helen was mentioning, a lot has changed with the COVID-19 pandemic, and the program that I am in charge of, the Waldron Student Alumni Connections program, is mainly an in-person career exploration program where I would bring alumni back to campus to speak with students about what they do so that students can see these various options and explore what's out there for them with this interdisciplinary degree from an arts and science background. And so we typically do these in person. Since we're not in person, we were doing a lot via Zoom, which is a change to the traditional programming. And we also wanted to think through other creative ways to reach students at this time. You know, they're studying at home, as Helen mentioned. There's probably a lot of different types of concerns they have. You know, graduating seniors were already stressed because you're graduating and you're going off into the real world. And now we have a very uncertain world they're entering. And so we really wanted to think through, you know, our overall brand with how we were releasing some digital content. So we have this Zoom meetings that we were doing with students and alumni that students seemed really receptive to, and alumni were, you know, we have definitely two buckets of alumni, some who are bored and have tons of time on their hand to help, some who are going through the challenges of the COVID pandemic and potentially getting furloughed and having some of those roadblocks in their own careers. So that was, you know, the first challenge. We had to find those alumni who were, you know, interested in engaging. And so the Zoom worked out well, and we wanted to start a podcast where we could share similar career stories for students over audio, because we have students who are studying in Asia, and, you know, a noon program on Zoom is the middle of the night for them. So the Zoom programs weren't, you know, really going to work for our global students. And so that's kind of where we started with this podcast, is that during COVID-19, we wanted to share resources to students. Podcasting is a really easy way to get that out there. And we wanted, in terms of like the branding considerations, you know, I'm a part of, my program is a part of the larger Weinberg College. So we wanted to brand the podcast under the college brand, so that we could have Waldron Student Alumni Connections episodes, but we could also explore different types of things in the future. You know, potentially conversations with the dean or faculty or students and things like that. And so branding it under the college rather than under my specific program allows us to have some different options in the future. So Weinberg in the World is the new podcast. And then we have, right now, we're having Waldron Career Conversations. We have 3 posted when we launched, because, you know, that was something we heard early on, is that when you're launching a podcast, you want to have multiple episodes. So if someone likes it, they can listen to another one. They don't have to wait the week or whatever your schedule is. They can just listen to it right then. And so, you know, we launched with 3 of these Waldron Career Conversations. But in terms of the Weinberg in the World podcast, it really fits under the dean's vision. He, part of his whole plan is having Weinberg and the world, you know, continuing to be promoted, and we have a lot of global focuses within our college, and that's a huge priority for us. And so it was a really great fit with our dean's vision. And we can add more to it down the road. So we just launched this to students this week. So, you know, we're excited to see the reception and see how they like it. We are doing 20 to 30 minute episodes, very casual conversation-y, similar to Northwestern Intersections, but very geared towards the arts and science background. So the questions are more like, what was your experience on campus? What did you major in? How is your arts and science background playing out in your career? And then we dive into some hot topics with, you know, the current pandemic. We talked with a radio host who was on radio when 9/11 happened. So we talked to her about like the similarities and differences between then and now. And a CEO about how to handle and prepare for crisis situations. We talked to a therapist about self-care and tips for handling uncertain times. So it's been really interesting to have those conversations. And this podcast, we started like on my laptop, no mic, no equipment. I'm recording in my closet, and like we're getting pretty good audio. And I think right now people are, you know, you even are listening to New York Times podcasts that they're recording in closets, because that's our situation right now. So I think like now more than ever is a great time to like explore audio, because no one's expecting like super crisp studio audio. So just another tidbit there. Lessons learned.
Lessons learned. So with Cassie starting her new podcast and me still trying to improve our current podcast of Northwestern Intersections, these are some of the lessons that we've learned so far, and we are still continuing to learn. And I'm sure the list will get longer and longer, but some of the things that we learned are, number one, garner support early. So I think Cassie did a really great job of getting the support that she needed during the research phase and preparation phase from the leadership team. It makes it so much easier to have that support from them, just so that you can comfortably and successfully research and actually move forward with your program. So that's really important. Second thing is work outside normal capacity to start. So I think one of the phases that takes a lot of time is the research phase and the preparation phase, only because you're starting something new and you want to make sure you have enough time to, release episodes that are of the highest quality so that you can continue to gain listeners after your launch. So make sure you set aside some time. So for me as an editor in the past, I made sure in my calendar, I set aside many, many hours to learn how to edit and actually edit each episode. And that did mean for me to kind of juggle between my other daily tasks that I had to do, and just, being open with my manager, who was very supportive of this idea that maybe some tasks I needed to do it a little bit later in the coming years or something like that. So be creative with your scheduling process. And then third one is constantly learn and adapt. So you're not going to have a successful podcast through every single episode. There is going to be a lot of learning curve that comes with it. It's super fun. Like I mean, Cassie can tell you this too. Like for me, it's really fun to see how the podcast is growing, but there will be a lot of learning curves. And you just, learn from your errors and learn from listening to yourself during the interview. And I think one of the biggest things was you listen to yourself and you realize you also say a certain word many, many times during the interview. I do that a lot. And that's apparently a trend, or it's something that you see in a lot of podcasters too. I hear that a lot when I listen to other podcasts. So little things like that will help you and go the long way. Fourth one is persevere. So we started our podcast, Northwestern Intersections. We launched in April 2018. So it's been about 2 years, which is crazy to me and probably crazy to Cassie too. And now she's starting a new podcast, which is amazing. But persevere, like it's fun. This is one of the best ways to engage your alumni. It's one of the easiest way, one of the cheapest ways to, I would say cost-effective ways to engage your alumni globally. So keep on doing it, learn from your mistakes, and also celebrate all the little things that do happen. And last but not least, technology is fun. So I think I also said that I don't have experience in audio editing, but the more you do it, the easier it gets. So do that, practice as much as you can. And even after you practice and you just can't get it, maybe ask some other colleague who might be interested and who has the bandwidth to take on this role, or not role, but maybe take on this, what am I trying to say? They have enough time to try editing or learning. Or, worst comes to worst, you can also outsource your episodes to freelancers who have the experience of editing episodes. We've done that before when we were both really swamped during one of our most, busiest times of the year. So, yeah.
Absolutely. And I am outsourcing editing for my program right now, which is really helpful. So thanks, Helen. And then considerations. These were just some things that I was thinking about to ask yourself as you're thinking about pursuing a podcast. And before I get into this list, I was also thinking that the data that you're getting from podcasting is a consideration, because I'm sure a lot of you are doing like events or webinars where you're gathering people's contact information when they participate. And with a podcast, you can't do that. You don't know who it is who's listening to your podcast. You know that there are so many listens, you don't necessarily know if those are individuals or if like one person is listening to all, 81 of your episodes. So it's a really great platform for getting your information out there and having a lot of potential people listen, but you can't really, there's only certain ways you can dive into the data. So if you have a senior leader who's like, I need to know who's listening, that's some information that you're really not going to gather who it is listening. But you're reaching more people, which is all, it's just a consideration as you're starting a podcast. So some other things to consider are your senior leaders interested in being innovative, because this is new and different and it takes time. And I think having that buy-in from, the top down is really important. And then do you have staff who are interested in starting something new and have the capacity for a new program? Helen and I were both really excited about this. And so we were okay with taking on a little bit extra work when we started it. When we started this program, I was running like a Dinner with 12 series, the webinars, and we added on the podcast too, because we were excited to do it. But I think you need to have someone who's motivated to add a little extra at the beginning. And then you can kind of work through how to figure out that process down the road. And then do you already have a way of consistently communicating with your alumni? This was something that we had when we were starting Northwestern Intersections, like I was saying, with the webinar emails, the monthly webinar emails. Now with my Weinberg in the World podcast, I'm communicating with students to invite them to events, but I'm not consistently, I don't have like a monthly email that's going out to them. So that's like a challenge that I'm now working through with how to get the information out to the students consistently, but not overdoing it, because I don't necessarily have a consistent way of communicating with them like over the summer, because we don't have events. So it's another consideration for you all with starting a podcast. And that's kind of our information for you all. We'd love to take some questions if anyone has any. And we'll kind of pass it off to Zach to see if we have any questions.
Cassie, Helen, thanks so much. We've had a ton of questions come in, actually. I don't think there's any way we're going to get to all of them, but there's some really good ones in here. One maybe to start is just about how much prep time or total time would you say it takes to create each episode? This person noted that they listened to a webinar on podcasting that suggested it takes about 1 hour of prep for every minute of a podcast. So a 20-minute podcast would take about 20 hours of work total. How does that compare, I guess, to your experience?
That seems a little extreme, but someone really broke it down, because I've never actually broken it down. Because if you're thinking through like the researching of alumni, that could be good. You're spending a lot of time on LinkedIn or wherever your alumni database, reaching out to them or getting a warm intro from a colleague or another alumnus. So there's definitely prep work in terms of the communications to get someone set up. But once you have a system, it's basically like you confirm a podcast and I copy and paste my email to them with like the questions and like have your headphones ready and all that tech stuff. So, as you do more episodes, that time it becomes a lot more efficient with the prep. And then when you're actually doing an episode, I like to book an hour for my 20 to 30 minute interviews right now. And so I can like spend maybe 10 minutes getting my setup ready in my house, in my closet, or in a conference room when we're back in the office. And then you have, some chit chat, 20 to 30 minute combo when you're done at the hour. And then after, you're talking about editing, which we outsource that. And so it's basically getting the file and uploading it for me. But Helen, in terms of preparation, you guys have longer episodes and you're working with a larger alumni base than my Weinberg College podcast is right now. So what's your experience with preparation?
Yeah, with preparation, it's very similar to what Cassie mentioned, that once you have a guest lined up, I just copy and paste the canned email invite to them. I set up an hour also, learn from the best aka Cassie, to set aside 60 minutes for the entire interview, but we've cut it down to 25 to 40 minutes max. And when it comes to the editing side, I will say in the very, very beginning when I was learning how to edit, it took about, I actually calculated this too, it took about an hour to edit 10 minutes of audio for me, because I was just learning and producing at the same time. So it took about an hour for 10 minutes. But over time, I've noticed it get the total amount of editing time got shorter and shorter. So you might want to actually record that and see how fast you can edit over time, because it's pretty interesting to see how fast you can edit over time. And then once that's done, I would upload it to Libsyn. That's Libsyn. I think somebody mentioned or asked that earlier in the question. It's called Libsyn. So we upload that there. Takes about a couple hours for it to upload, but we have a set time that we release each episode. So we release every Thursdays at 1 a.m. so that when people wake up, they can see it pop up on their podcast streaming apps or etc. So yeah.
Great, thank you. Yeah, the 1 hour per minute of audio also sounded like maybe a little much to me. So glad to have your perspective on that. One person asked about, do you have sponsors for the podcast? Have you considered having sponsors for either podcast? Just any thoughts on that?
We've never thought through sponsors of the podcast. We have, both of our programs have funding to launch and continue on with our program. And we've wanted to keep it like close to, what our content is. So that's not something we've really ever, Helen, you can correct me if I'm wrong, if you guys have considered it since I've left, but not something we've thought through that fits within like our goals with the podcast and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, I'll piggyback on that too. We haven't had a sponsor or thought about it, only because our goal is to engage alumni globally, and make them feel like there's alumni out there that they can really relate to by listening to this podcast. I will say, you can collaborate with your external departments if you want to get your podcasts out there, and just have that branding throughout the campus. It's something that you can do, but we've just never had a sponsor.
Yeah. And is that, Zach, does that answer the question?
I think so. Yeah, they were just curious about that. Someone, and Cassie, you alluded to this a little bit, but someone is just asking about kind of the preparation, particularly the script and the kind of questions that you ask. It sounded like you said you have kind of a standard set of questions that you maybe ask everyone. Just how do you decide that kind of in advance, and work with the person you're interviewing before the event, so they're kind of prepared?
Yeah, definitely. I cannot remember, honestly, how we did it with Northwestern Intersections. With the Weinberg in the World podcast, I've been sharing like a format that I will follow. Like I mentioned earlier, what was your experience on campus? And kind of naturally flow through it. Like I'm not reading off my questions. It's like conversational. So depending on how they respond to the first one, I may not ask like the follow-up question about what internships were, impactful to you. So I have set questions, but I ask them off of what the alumnus will say. So, and I send that with Weinberg in the World, I do send them the questions that I will ask in advance. And with Northwestern Intersections, it was a little bit more free form. It was a little bit more like I had it in my head. We're going to talk through, their experience on campus and then their career. Or I think we started with their first job and then what they're doing now. And we worked through the in-between just based off where the conversation was going. So I didn't have as many set questions for that one. With the Weinberg in the World, it's a little bit more targeted with the information I want to gather. So yeah, I do send them the questions in advance. And then will always ask at least one or two that's not on there. And most alumni are fine with that.
Yeah, and I will say, so something that I started doing is, I think Cassie, you might have done this too, but I also set up a time to really connect with my guests before the actual interview. So I would maybe ask them to meet with me virtually for 30 minutes, just so that I can hear their story in advance. And I asked them if there are any stories that really stand out to them during their lives, or if there are any qualities about them or any cool or unforeseen job circumstances or anything like that, those things that people want to hear. I pick those out, and then I kind of brainstorm on my own after the conversation to see how can I bring this section up so that my guests will mention that, or what kind of question do I want to answer so that I can get the response from my guests that I want, which is something that people might want to hear. So it's helpful to actually meet with your guests beforehand to just get a feel of their story, how they feel, and then to build that rapport before the actual interview so that you both feel comfortable talking to each other.
Absolutely. And in those pre-interview phone calls, you can gauge, okay, is this someone I might need to cut off because they run on? Or is this someone who's very concise with their answers and I'm going to need more questions? So it'll give you an idea, like Helen mentioned, like what you want to focus on and highlight and make sure you get out of the interview, but also how they sound over audio. And you can anticipate needing more questions or needing to interrupt someone, because that's a huge challenge, to interrupt someone if they're a run-on type of person. So yeah, Helen, great point. Pre-interview phone calls are huge. I always talk to everyone I'm interviewing beforehand.
Great. Here's another question that, and a few people have sort of alluded to this in the questions, but just about how many full-time equivalent people, or kind of how many hours are spent on the podcasting process. And then do they all work in the alumni office? And how many podcasts are you actually kind of putting out kind of each week or each season, and that sort of breakdown?
So I will say, yeah. There's a lot packed in that question. So maybe I'll start off with how many full-time employees. So when Cassie and I started, it was just us two, and then we actually asked another program assistant, same team, but in a separate cohort, I would say, who was also interested in audio editing. So we included him, and we became the trio of the podcast team. So that was super helpful. I know that, so for Northwestern, we, as the Alumni Relations and Development Department, we're not the only ones who are producing podcasts. Our medical office, the Feinberg School of Medicine, our business school, all our professional schools have one, and I've definitely connected with all of them. And it seems like they all have their main host, and either the host would edit, or they also asked another colleague to join them to be the editor, producer, and to help them with the production side of it. So it seems like there's at least 2 full-time employees. And it doesn't mean that podcasting is their only project in their portfolio, but it's something that they do leave a lot of time aside for that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I would reiterate that it's not, there aren't like one full-time employee only on the podcast. We have lots of other responsibilities in addition to the podcasting. Like in my role, I'm still doing Zoom meetings, programs for students, like our traditional programming. And in addition to that, doing the podcast. And so I think in terms of like the time right now, since I was just in launching the phase, I was probably doing like 30% of what my time was spent on podcasting and 70% on my like traditional job. And like this week is a little different because I have a bunch of interviews. I have 4 interviews this week. So this week is more like 50-50 podcast and traditional role. If that kind of helps in terms of like the time that it takes on a podcast. Because that's something I don't think either of us have really broken down, the time we're spending on the individual things we're working on. But there is a time investment into it.
Great, thanks. We're at the top of the hour, so just one last question. Someone had a toddler meltdown, so they missed your previous answer. Just can you spell out again the tool you're using to post the podcast to multiple places at the same time?
Yeah, so it's called Libsyn. It's Libsyn. I think it's short for lubricated syndication. Yeah. So that website's been around for a long time, but that's something that you can use to host and release to all popular podcast streaming apps. There's also Spreaker. It's spelled Spreaker. So we use that because that website allows you to have a customized embedded code that looks that could have your logo, your university logo on there. And we use that to upload the player onto our website. That's optional, but that's also something that we use. So for the NAA, we have two websites that we use.
Great. Well, thank you both so much. There are a number of other questions that we just aren't able to get to in the time, but I'll send those over to the two of you, and the ones you're able to maybe give a quick answer, we'll maybe be able to get back to some of the folks. But thank you everyone so much for tuning in. Helen, Cassie, thank you so much for sharing your expertise. And the folks listening, there are other webinars coming up in our series for advancement professionals. Our one for June is on town and gown relations for how alumni offices can better engage their community. And we also have all of our white label webinars for the members of the Alumni Learning Consortium that are open to alumni professionals as well to check out. So again, Cassie, Helen, thank you so much. Everyone have a wonderful rest of your day. And stay well.
Thanks, Zach.
Thanks.
Thanks.